Dear friends, dear colleagues, welcome to the lectures by Dr. Yong Vrhovski. I can't pronounce correctly, sorry. At first, as usual, I will give a short introduction about Dr. Yong Vrhovski. This is the picture of him, Dr. Yong Vrhovski, very young, handsome, very friendly. Okay, have delivered invited online lectures at Wuhan University. The first lecture, History of Mathematical Logic in China, from its beginnings to Tsinghua University, Prague. The second lecture, the twists and turns of introduction, investigations into the beginnings of new realism and mathematical logic in China, 1920s. Next Friday night, the same time. Okay. At first, I gave a brief introduction about Dr. Yong Vrhovski. He got his master's degree in comparative Indo-European linguistics and philology in 2012 from University of Ljubljana, Slovenia. He got 2 PhDs, 1 PhD in philology and history and philosophy of science, awarded by the Chen University, Prague, PhD in philosophy, philosophy of language and logic from University of Ljubljana, Slovenia. He was lecturer for philology at University of Ljubljana, Slovenia. Right now, he is an assistant professor at this university. He is also one editor of the journal Asian Studies and editorial board member of several academic journals, such as Contemporary Chinese Thoughts, Asian Philosophy. His area of research specialization, history of philosophy of science in China, history of logic in China, history of analytical philosophy in China, comparative intellectual history, mathematical logic, philosophy of Wittgenstein. He published more than 10 refereed articles in well-recognized academic journals, such as History and Philosophy of Logic, Review of Religion and Chinese Society, International Communication of Chinese Culture, Journal of the Oxford Center for Buddhist Studies, Asian Studies, Contemporary Chinese Thought. This is his representative publications for 10. The first, I just said first, Tsinghua School of Logic, Mathematical Logic at Tsinghua University in Peking, 1926 to 1945. History and Philosophy of Logic, last year. I once read and reviewed some of his academic articles. My impression, they are very informative, for they rely on many textual materials, even noticing, or at least long systematically investigated by Chinese scholars. They are well organized and clearly written, and be new contributions to the early history of mathematical logic and analytical philosophy in modern China. I can be knowing that the author has excellent scholarship training, rigorous academic attitude, and good academic judgment. Especially, I and he co-edited the special issue, History of Logic in Contemporary China of Asian Studies, published on May 9th this year, consisting of 9 English papers, which respectively summarize and evaluate the 70 years development of logic in China from 1949 to 2019, with 404 pages. This is the first time to introduce contemporary logic study in China as a whole into the English academic circle, which will help the Western academic colleagues to understand the current situation and the achievements of Chinese logicians. This is the front page of the journal. Special issue. Yes, my young colleague, Professor Chen will be the interlocutor of Dr. Yong or Vrhovski. Polite. Chen this is the got his PhD from National University of Singapore. Then he was postdoctoral at the University of Münster, Germany. Then from 2015 to 2019, associate professor at the School of Philosophy, Wuhan University. From 2019 to present, he is professor, my colleague. His research field, modern logic, foundations of mathematics, proof theory, philosophy of mathematics and logic, current research interest, understanding in the incompleteness, understanding the independence, philosophy of mathematics and logic. I won some honor, just mentioned two. Silver medal of 2014 Kurt Gödel Research Prize Fellowships offered by the Kurt Gödel Society in Australia, 2014. National 10,000 plan for young top talents Cheng 2019. I published one English book in spring incompleteness for higher order arithmetic. Right now, we almost finished a large English book, Research on Girders Incompleteness Theorems. I published more than 10 English papers in top journals, such as the Journal of Symbolic Logic, Mathematical Logic Quarterly, the Bulletin of Symbolic Logic, Layers of Pure and Applied Logic, Archive of Mathematical Logic, Philosophia Mathematica. So, now, welcome Dr. Yong Vrhovski gave his first lecture, History of Mathematical Logic in China, from its beginnings to Tsinghua University. He talks more than 1 hour, and then Professor Chen will give his short comments and questions, at most 15 minutes. The audience, please write down your questions in chat room. The staff at 学士志 will forward your questions to me and to Dr. Yong Vrhovski. Then he will give his short replies. Welcome, Dr. Yong Vrhovski.
Thank you very much, Professor Chen, for this excellent, albeit a little bit too long for such a young scholar, introduction. I'm really honored to be with you today. Not so much because I'm working with history of mathematical logic, about which you are all experts in, but so much more that I am able to present to the audience at Wuhan Daxue, which is also a subject of my today's talk. Now I will first share my screen with you, because I've got PPTs. So share. PPT. Okay. Okay. So today I will speak about history of mathematical logic in China. The time frame I will focus on will be from its beginnings to the period at Tsinghua University in Beijing. Here you can see the outline of the lecture. The main subject will be the idea and academic discipline of mathematical logic in, number one, May 4th period to the late 1920s, covering introduction of the notion of mathematical logic, Bertrand Russell, special development in Beijing, 1925, development at Yanjing University in Beijing. Number two, late Republican period, which means from the late 1920s to 1937, which will cover Tsinghua School of University, mathematical logic as a branch of mathematics at Wuhan University, mathematical logics in a national system of education, meaning secondary schools and universities, and if time will allow, I will also speak a little bit about terminology and terminological standardization. The point number three, which is the period from the Second Sino-Japanese War to the PRC period, 1949, will be obviously left out due to insufficient material. Now, first, before I begin, I would like to share my thoughts with you about the entire endeavor, the entire undertaking for a scholar such as me, such as myself, who am researching Chinese history, Chinese intellectual history, here from the Western western brinks of the world, several thousand kilometers away, I would like to point out that I'm doing something as a second-hand history. I'm trying to interpret history of an intellectual history of people who are really remote from us here in Western culture. That is to say, I'm trying to understand what went on, whereas the real subjects, the audience, people who shall judge upon what I'm saying are, of course, you, because you are, due to your proximity to your roots, due to your actually living in Chinese culture, in China, you have the better means to judge on your own history than I do. I'm just presenting some sort of a frame, and I will be your student today, and you shall be my professors, judging about what I say and what I say wrong, and where I might be misunderstanding what I say. First, let me tell you that since I'm researching not only mathematical logic as a branch of mathematics, or in the early history, also a branch of philosophy, I am also researching mathematical logic as a phenomenon within Chinese intellectual history. This means that I'm, whether I want it or not, I'm covering several different notions of mathematical logic. What I mean by notions of mathematical logic? By a notion, I can mean a word, a concept which has been introduced into a new cultural environment, such as China at the beginning of the 1920s. I can mean B, a notion denoting an entire discourse, which is a discourse per se. And I can mean C, a notion which combines the first intellectual notion and the discourse notion into one and treats them as one. In the framework of the third notion, I'm usually referring to a system of objectivity. Objectivity as an attitude towards how science makes sense for everyday life as a whole, how science is related to moral questions, how science relates to philosophy, etc. I will try to explain to you what I mean by all these notions as I go through the lecture. I hope that you will understand what my methodological foundations, what my considerations when it comes to notions of mathematical logic do really mean in the context of history of mathematical logic in China. So, let us begin. The history of mathematical logic as a notion, as a term present in Chinese intellectual discourse, starts in the May 4th period. Now, at this stage, we are still not speaking about the presence of mathematical logic within Chinese academic philosophy, right? We are still not speaking about the presence of mathematical logic within the sheer walls of Chinese universities, but more so in the written discourse, in articles, as a notion spoken about, as a notion part of modernity, which the Chinese intellectuals at the time were trying to introduce to China. After this initial period, there follows a short period of institutionalization. What we mean by that is simply the entrance of mathematical logic, not only as a notion, but as a subject, as content, as a part of a branch of philosophy into Chinese universities, which occurred roughly in the late 1920s, in the framework of what we now know as Tsinghua School of Logic. Then we also speak about mathematization of mathematical logic, which seems to be somehow contradictory. But as mathematical logic was first introduced and actually existed as a part of philosophy more than a part of mathematics, such was also the development as a notion, as a discourse in Chinese academia. So the mathematization, when mathematical logic became a part of mathematics again, or anew, happened in early 1930s in the framework of popularization of mathematics, which swept through the entire country, as well as in the framework of a small circle of mathematicians at Wuhan University. Concurrently with all these changes, when mathematical logic underwent transformation from a mere notion within an intellectual discourse into something which is a part of academia, a part of system of knowledge, there also happened an inclusion into the national system of education, secondary schools, normal schools, and universities. What is important to know about this inclusion is that it did not happen merely on the basis of its former integration into universities, but the other way around. It happened due to the presence of the notion of mathematical logic within a popular discourse, which I shall in detail address when I go on with my lecture. And all this, since we are actually tracking a wide range of intellectual changes, we are also covering a wide period of time. There also appeared parallel terminological changes, which were pertinent not only to the vocabulary used in books, but also in more general academic official language used in newspapers, etc. What I'm mostly referring to here is the notion of logic itself, because as you know, in the Republican period, you had many different terms denoting the idea behind logic and or represented by logic. So if time will allow, I will address this in the end. So as we all know, let's go now to the micro level. Let's speak now about the details. As we all know, or as we are supposed to know, mathematical logic as a notion was first introduced to China via philosophy and via concrete present of the British philosopher, mathematician, activist Bertrand Russell in China. Although Bertrand Russell visited China in the years between 1920 and 1921, his presence in Chinese intellectual discourse began much earlier. If I could guess, I could conjecture, his presence began around 1919 when a few intellectuals started writing about his work more in detail, and when they tried to introduce his work into the framework of the May 4th intellectual movement of the entire undertaking of Chinese modernization. However, as these things go, personal engagement, personal contact usually makes the greatest impact. So Russell's impact increased drastically when he actually visited China in October 1920 and left China in July 1921. While he was staying in China, although he lectured at several universities and newly established institutions such as the Lecture Society or the Bertrand Russell Study Society, which was based in Beijing, he also lectured and covered a wide range range of different topics. He also lectured about mathematical logic on only 2 occasions, although there was a whole series of lectures planned. But these lectures were initially, which were initially quite ambitiously set, were stopped due to his illness in April 1921. Now, the thing with Russell is that he had a really complicated relationship with the Chinese intellectual atmosphere at the time, because the Chinese intellectuals, both from the revolutionary youth, from the future founders of the Communist Party, even, as well as more differently oriented, politically oriented scholars, were all expecting something from him. Yang Qichao, for example, was focusing more on we need to extract some methodology from Russell, not his entire thought, but just he spoke about Russell's finger, golden fingers, which would turn everything into gold he would touch. So Yang Qichao had something methodologically in mind. People at Beijing University, Tsai Yuanpei, the director of Beijing University, was really well informed about the depth of Russell's philosophy, and he was more expecting Russell to lecture about mathematical logic, about his philosophy of mind, about his philosophy of matter, his interpretation of modern physics. Whereas the most leftist part of his audience, who were actually really fond of Bertrand Russell because he offered an alternative to Dewey's and Husserl's pragmatism, they expected Russell to tell them about the October Revolution, about his own socialism, to speak about Marxism. And of course, none of them actually received what they wanted from Russell in the first round. As much as we know, his lectures on mathematical logic were actually quite well visited, but we are not sure how people understood the content he was lecturing. The content was, fortunately, please correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm speaking from my mind now, was translated by Zhao Yuanrong, who had this forte that he had a PhD from philosophy of mathematics. Some even say mathematical logic, but this is relatively incorrect. So the lectures were well translated. Fortunately, among the masses, among the audience, there were also 2 young, ambitious Chinese mathematicians, one of whom we know well due to his work due to his contributions to the foundations of geometry in the years to follow, Fu Zhongsun, and the other was Jiang Bangming, who unfortunately passed away in 1926. These 2 young scholars not only later translated Russell's Introduction to Mathematical Philosophy, but also taught about what was said by Russell in the lecture. They sent him a series of questions, technical questions about the content of his lectures, which they later also used in their translation of Introduction to Mathematical Philosophy, which was published in 1923, 1924, with the commercial press in Shanghai. However, amongst the most important figures for propagating the notion of mathematical logic was, especially in the early years, was Zhang Shenfu. Zhang Shenfu was obviously not his given name, not his birth name, but his later, actually, first pen name and then name he used regularly. His name is, of course, Zhang Songyan. He was older brother of Zhang Dainian. You're all, I'm sure, quite familiar with him because around 12 years ago, the research on brothers Zhang increased in China, and many new publications came out. So we could say that the Chinese intellectual world is rediscovering the contributions of Zhang, which were several and really progressive, though unfortunately, I must say that when it came to mathematical logic, not too deep. But as we know, it's when you are starting a new field of research, not only knowledge is important, but also the spirit. And Zhang Shenfu was the spiritual father of mathematical logic, so to say. He was the propagator, the popularizer of mathematical logic. And he was the person who first wrote about Russell in numerous articles in the leading Chinese journals, newspapers at the time, in the May 4th, within the May 4th movement. Now, Zhang's forte was not only that he happened to stumble upon Russell's writings, for example, articles in monism from the monist, articles from the monist and from this important journals, scientific, which came to Beijing around 1916 when the Beijing University Library was first put together, established. But his forte, his advantage was that he studied not only mathematics, which he studied first, but also philosophy. He studied mathematics not only at the undergraduate level, but also later joined the Institute for Mathematics, which is the graduate school of mathematics at Beijing Daoxue, at the very crucial moment where professors there, who are really important for mathematics in China, were introducing elements of set theory, Cantorian set theory to their students. And Zhang focused on set theory when he was a student, which was around 1917, 1918. Some of his reports were even published in Beijing Beida's newspaper. I don't remember whether it was weekly or daily edition. Because Zhang discovered Russell, he later moved also to philosophy and had the honor, although he was not so much a fan of Zhang Shijiao, but he had the opportunity to listen to Zhang Shijiao's lectures on history of Chinese logic and history of logic in general. As we know from Professor Bean's research, Zhang Shijiao was really much influenced by the Millian school at the University of Aberdeen, and he introduced the notion of logic in the milieu, which encompassed this empirical spirit, empirical epistemological foundations, etc. Notions which were taken from Millian philosophy. He also consequently, he also focused on induction, but he created a bridge between what he knew about traditional Chinese philosophy. I'm obviously referring to Bing Xue, and what he knew about modern formal logic in the West, which was really revolutionary because at the time at Beijing University, logic was taught more in a pragmatist fashion, as a psychologistical topic, as a topic which was interpreted in the context of anatomy of human mind as something binding together rational and intuitive. But we shall not engage in analysis of pragmatism, but continue following Zhang Shenfu's engagement with Russell here. So here we see a picture, which is a really bad but informative enough photograph of Bertrand Russell when he arrived to Beijing University. Zhang Shenfu is in the left corner. So here, in the extreme left corner. He actually received Russell in Shanghai. He was sent by the Beijing University and received Russell in Shanghai when he arrived in October 1920, and later had the chance to converse with Russell over tea in Beijing. This was in early 1921, late 1920. And in this conversation they had, I don't know in which hotel in Beijing, they established some sort of a relationship of admiration and continued to write to each other for the years to follow. And when Zhang Shenfu left the meeting, he became one of the most passionate, most ardent propagator of philosophy of Bertrand Russell, philosophy and logic of Bertrand Russell in China for decades to follow. And of course, Russell was really impressed by Zhang Shenfu's knowledge of his own writings. It was said that he wrote a letter to, don't know whom, to one of his friends, probably. I'm not sure, I will not say anything because I forgot. Russell wrote a letter to one of his friends saying that there is a person in China who knows all my works, who has read all my works and knows a lot about my work. He was really impressed by that. But when we are speaking about notion of mathematical logic in Zhang Shenfu's understanding, that's another story. We should not be too hasty. We should not say, well, the West came and the West introduced itself in its entirety, I mean, as intellectual entirety, to the Chinese intellectual discourse. No. The process of introduction, the process of adoption was much more complicated, because these ideas were introduced into the Chinese intellectual discourse. And into means that the Chinese, the native discourse, was in vast majority, which means that the referential framework was traditional. And the only way to understand isolated notions from the Western philosophy and Western science was to create new referential networks which were based on the meaning of reference, which was still native. What I mean by that, I said really something which actually needs some more explanation. What I mean by that is that although we can speak about the name mathematical logic, what mathematical logic meant for other categories and concepts within the intellectual discourse of the time was conditioned by the native discourse more than it was conditioned by the meaning of mathematical logic in the West. So when we are speaking about Zhang Shenfu's understanding of what mathematical logic actually means, what is the content of mathematical logic, he would still, in the years between 1919 and 1920, he would still interpret it within the discourse, intellectual discourse, which went on at Chinese universities at that time. He would, for example, say, and this is something taken from Russell's work, he would say, the most modern logic, mathematical logic, can give our thoughts wings, empower our abstract imagination, and equip us with the possibilities never imagined before. This is taken partly from Russell's, I don't remember which work. I think that it was Principles of Mathematics, somewhere in the introduction. But Zhang Shenfu understood this quite literally. And in his work, we can see the tendency to describe mathematical logic as the ultimate, the most fundamental methodology, which can change everything. He understood Russell's the part of the role of mathematical logic played in Russell's philosophy as some sort of total role. Without mathematical logic, Russell would not have discovered the meaning of freedom. Russell would not have been such a philosopher. Russell would not have been such a mathematician. Russell would not have been such a person. And this is this total comprehensive way of looking at the personality of scholar. Moral integrity is the same as knowledge. Knowledge has got its root in Li, in understanding the principles or patterns of the universe. And these are actually two sides of the same thing. There are 相反相成的. This is actually quite a traditional notion. And in his writings, he wrote that mathematical logic can be used in women's liberation, in emancipation of marriage problems, etc. So this is so much important for us because we need to understand that this is a notion of mathematical logic which had a living function. It was a part of a much broader audience. And since Zhang Shunfu was one of the founders of Chinese Communist Party, it was also taught, the same thoughts were taught at their meetings in the rooms of Beijing Library, where Zhang taught young communists about logic. He taught them about Russell. This is also one of the reasons why the young Marxists were so eager to meet Russell, because they had such high hopes about him. And this is partly due to Zhang Shunfu. This is for us important to understand so that we know how a discipline which is introduced can have many different levels, many different ways of living. Now, in Chinese, following Russell's visit and following a brief period when Russell's translations of Russell's work were published in China, which was roughly between 1920 and 1924. We don't know much about this period. We just know that there was a lot published. And this was all some sort of wave emanating from the period of his visit in China. Also, at Beijing Daxue, there happened a minor shift in curricular content, which was caused by his presence there, because Russell's presence and the presence of his adherents at Beijing University was understood as some sort of a push against pragmatism, because by 1919, pragmatism has infested. It's not a nice word to use, but the pragmatism took up almost 100% of the entire curriculum. And even John Dewey lectured there, and he had like 3-4 lectures about his several different layers of his philosophy. So even Yang Qichao understood inviting Russell to Beijing University as a push against, as a balancing act. So they wanted to see this Russellian objectivism being introduced into the curriculum at Beijing University. This happened only to a limited extent, where, for example, introduction to scientific methodology was suddenly a part of curriculum at the Department of Philosophy, where suddenly more modern periods of history of Western philosophy were taught at the department, where even Russell's thought was taught, where the logical curriculum got upgraded, and we suddenly have lectures about Boole, De Morgan, and even piano, even later founders of mathematical logic. But this stopped abruptly. So the mid-1920s are still an enigma. What is known to me so far is that there was relatively open debate, a written debate, which happened between 1925 and 1956, which was initially on Fu Zhongson's and Zhang Bangming's translation of Russell's Introduction to Mathematical Philosophy. And this debate later developed into a discussion about the notion of infinitely small, also known as infinitesimal. The notion of infinitesimal was also mentioned in the above mentioned book, in Russell's Introduction, which is also why the wider public discovered this notion and found it difficult to understand. And this prompted a development of debate which lasted for an entire year. And the participants in this debate were Zhang Fu, obviously, because he was the representative of this Russell current in China, Fu Zhongsun as a translator. Zhang Bangming sadly died in the same year. And the debate was also later joined by Wang Dianji, who will be one of the stars of the remaining lectures. And one important development also, which I'm sure you all know about, is the Wang Dianjin's first textbook on mathematical logic, which was published in 1927. So I will now give a little bit more terse introduction to Wang Dianjin's work because of his proximity to Wuhan University. Not so much because of his immense role in the history of mathematical logic, which unfortunately didn't happen due to his political affiliation at the time. So this is one of the rarest images we have of Wang Dianji. I don't know where it was taken, but it merits publication, I would say. It's a beautiful photograph. So Wang Dianji was born in the year 1900 in Cheng, which I believe is quite close to Wuhan, where you are, Wuhan, where you're staying. So he was, I don't know how far away it was, but he was a local. He studied mathematics and philosophy at Beijing University between 1916 and 1919. This meant that he was probably a colleague of Zhang Fu at both the departments. So they knew each other probably. After 1919, he decided to continue to pursue his studies in advanced mathematics, philosophy, and mathematical logic in French universities. First, as was the habit at the time, was he visited and studied at Sino-French University of Lyon, which was a logical way to go, because it was, I think that it was for free for Chinese scholars at the time, for Chinese students. And then he continued his studies at the University of Paris, which at that time was the name of Sorbonne, the Parisian university #1. In 1925, now, before he returned, we are not sure whether Wang Dianji obtained a doctoral degree or whether it was just an MA or an advanced degree after MA, because I have searched for his dissertation in the Sorbonne library and I wasn't able to find it. But at that time, the papyrology was really demanding, so this remains open for me, at least. So after he finished his studies in France, he returned to China and lectured first at Beida, at Beijing Sifan Daxue and Zhongguo Daxue, obviously in Beijing. And later, I forgot to mention that he also taught at Jinan Daxue, from where he was expelled in 1928 due to his political affiliations. He mostly lectured about Western logic and modern philosophy. And we can see that when he arrived at Beida in 1925, which was roughly at the time when the Russellian spirit was still present in the department. But unfortunately, he soon left, as did other adherents, other proponents of Russell's philosophy of modern scientism, it was called at the time, scientism, philosophical scientism. Also left around 1925. One of such prominent professors was Fu Peiqing. I don't know. I didn't pronounce the tones well, so I apologize for that. But after he was actually pushed out first from Beijing and later from Shanghai, he returned to Wuhan, where he taught philosophy at Wuchang University first, and became the member of Wuhan Daxue Preparatory Committee. So he was one of the people who organized the establishment of your university. Quite obviously, he was the member of a group who thought about how philosophy and how education sciences ought to be taught at Wuhan University, which is why he is really important, and which is why Wuhan University shares some more genealogical connection to mathematical logic in China. For this reason, Wang merits quite a lot of attention from us. I think I will use 40 minutes more, and then I will have to stop because I'm getting too tedious. I'm getting too much into the details. But anyway, I think we will get through. So Wang's dissertation is the first thing which merits our attention. This is the first book which was published on mathematical logic, on explicating mathematical logic in China. And obviously, it has also got mathematical logic in the title. So he referred to mathematical logic as 数学逻辑, and the way he used logic at the time instead of Lunli was really modern. So he wanted his book to look really modern at that time. Roughly speaking, this was a book which first covered some important aspect related to logical calculi from the Principia Mathematica. This is the book's importance. And it was allegedly written on the basis of Wang's dissertation, submitted at the Paris University in 1924, 1925. Right? As I said, I'm not sure. The book was structured into two parts. The first was obviously traditional formal logic, and the second was principles of mathematical logic. As a book on logic, which was published in China at that time, it was really important that Wang should define the idea of logic, his notion of logic. What did he mean by logic? Because at that time, there were many, many different notions of logic present in the general discourse outside philosophy as well as inside philosophy. There were many competing schools about logic. And he defined logic as a tool required in objective rational thinking, yet a tool which does not grant rationality, but takes the role of a method, how to skillfully use rationality. He surprisingly spoke about logical space and the space of science, which for me, although I cannot confirm it, is highly reminiscent of Wittgenstein, especially when he speaks about logical space, but nevertheless, this was quite early. So let us not push too far our analogy with Wittgenstein here. He also, which was important for Chinese intellectual discourse at the time, he also defined this logic, his logic, within Ren within the view on life. Now, Ren was a really important idea circulating in Chinese philosophical circle world at the time. And as we know from the science and metaphysics debate, it represented an opposition to Russellian or to empirical, to objectivist scientific philosophy or philosophy of science. But he needed to address it because it was in the middle of Chinese philosophical discourse. One of the most important aspects of his book is the very modern definition of the role of logic within science. He also discussed, though not at length, the axiomatic basis of science and their relationship with logic. Here we have two examples of what he was thinking about logic. He said that logic must embody three epistemological principles, that from the way in which the phenomena appear, one can make inferences about phenomena per se, that the formal deconstruction and expression of what is perceived directly reflects the thing which exists behind a certain appearance. Number two, that all kinds of differently abstract inferences can be treated as equal. And number three, that logical relations between concepts correspond to the actual relations between things. This clearly already in the introduction really shows us that he was imbibed with a resilient formula, with the logic as device in the Principia Mathematica. He recognized the importance of, obviously, the external theory of external relations, etc., which was really relatively early for a book, not for an article appearing in Chinese intellectual discourse. He also, this was quite typical for proponents of mathematical logic. He also claimed that in an all-encompassing investigation of the phenomena of the universe, one should make use of the most developed formal science called mathematical logic. So this was a relationship of identity. Mathematical logic is the very, very basis, covering, methodologically covering all natural sciences, all positive, objective sciences. But he remained in the domain of reasoning, opposite to Zhang Xinfu, and still said that mathematical logic possesses the capacity to fix the rules of proving and could effectively play the role of a method capable of strengthening and rectifying both our language and our thought. Wang also concludes that in the 19th century, mathematical logic really deserves the title Science of Sciences. Why I'm saying here today, why I am saying this today here, why I'm reiterating this, is that this is really so typical, so representative of the notion of mathematical logic in general intellectual discourse. Although this appeared in a specialized textbook, this was more typical for the general image of mathematical logic than impactful on the development of the discipline as such. Unfortunately, Wang's textbook did not become a major, as far as I know, did not become a major teaching tool used at Chinese universities, at least when it comes to the most prominent ones in Beijing, the ones which are known to me historically. This is on the left side. Here you can see the structure of the book I'm talking about, which is the treatise on logic and mathematical logic. We can see that he devoted quite a lot of energy to introducing calculi of mathematical logic from Principia Mathematica, which was calculus of logical propositions, calculus of classes, and calculus of logical relations. And we should also consider this work as important in this regard. At the same time, as it was an early work, the terminology was in greater part of his own invention, which meant that it was not so much intelligible to all those who were already immersed in what have been terminologically achieved so far in China, because he just returned from the West. And this was typical from Chinese scholars returning from the West, that they had reinvented their own Chinese terminology. The same could be said for Jin Yuelin, who in 1927, in the same year as this was published, started publishing articles, and his terminology was still really a bit shady, not so clear, because it takes time to get familiar with what was happening terminologically when you were absent. Wang also wrote and published several other books. One was 科学方法. This was a textbook which was written for the first three forms of education, general education at Chinese universities, where suddenly introduction to scientific method became one of the selective subjects at junior levels of studies of humanities. For example, at Beta, it happened a little bit earlier due to Wang Xinggong, who started teaching a course on that in 1923, so 4 years before that. Wang Dinji also published another book on logic, which was some sort of a sequel to his dissertation. And this book was also relatively important for us, or at least interesting for us to notice. Because in this book, he introduced an entirely new set of terminology. So he was at China for 1 decade, and he got himself familiar with the terminology, with the terminological needs of the entire discourse. And he gave some new introductions. For example, he gave an introduction to Russell's theory of logical types. He interestingly, amongst other, also introduced Schaeffer's theory that we are able to construct the entire propositional calculus on the notion of incompatibility, and Nico's definition of elementary propositions constructed with the help of Schaeffer's primitive function. This is only to see where his interests at the time were. But in 1937, as it was already the period where the national spirit was at its heights, where Chinese subjectivity was being discovered anew, where, for example, Chen and Zhang Shunfu started the movement of sinicization of Western philosophy in 1936, and the same spirit later caught up also with the Communist Party. At that time, he started discovering Chinese tradition and started introducing traditional concepts into his explanations of modern logic, modern Western logic, which is really typical also for the 1930s. So we see the importance of the general intellectual discourse on even scholars like Wang Dinji, who actually studied, who was actually a specialist in mathematics, and he studied mathematical logic. So the importance of introducing modern logic into the Chinese discourse, not replacing Chinese discourse with modern logic, but introducing it, importing it. And this was a little bit stronger represented in the 1930s. For example, although this book actually tries to introduce many valued calculi, tries to introduce Jan Lukasiewicz theory of calculus. He mentioned Starsky. He still felt the need to introduce the meaning of key concepts to his Chinese readership, and he did it, for example, in the example of relation. He did it in this way. He said, things between heaven and earth need to have coexistence. Among people living in one family, there must be kinship. What we here call coexistence and kinship is the existence of relations. It is said that every single existence in the universe can all be expressed at least in terms of one single relation, no matter how many layered or how complicated. Everything can be transformed into relations. The proportion of numbers, the equilibrium of quantity, the regularity of form, the class of quality, every single one of this is generated by relations, down to mundanity of human emotions and wisdom, the distinction between right and wrong, good and evil, and individuum in society, survival in war. How could all this avoid having numerous relations? This is so surprising, especially for me, to find in a textbook, which in the subsequent sections discusses really technical issues, not at depth, which we would expect, but at, let's say, elementary, introductory level for universities. But this, we have to understand this in order to understand the life of the notion beyond the intellectual discourse, beyond the academic discourse, sorry, beyond the institutionalization of mathematical logic. This is also the content of his second book, but I will not keep you here. We have to rush forward. So the 1925-1926 debate. Also, I will not linger for a long time here, because sorry, it jumped. Because this is a relatively not so important debate, which is interesting more from the perspective of intellectual history and less from the history of mathematical logic and the trajectory of how mathematical logic advanced at that time in Chinese discourse. But it suffices to mention that it was conducted in the above three journals: Xiandai Pinglun, the Modern Critic, I think, the Tiger Weekly, and Jingbao Fugang, which is the supplement to the Jingbao newspaper. It was conducted between June 1925 and January 1926. Participants in the debate were Sun Baochi, Zhang Shengfu, Fu Zhongsun, Ding Xilian, Xu Kejia, Yu Wenwei, and Wang Jianji. At the time, Xu and Yu were still students of philosophy at Beida, so it was a mixed company. And Yu Wenwei, as I will tell you at my second lecture next week, was one of the earlier passionate young propagator of new realism in Chinese academia. As I mentioned, the topics were first the translation of Bertrand Russell's book, and later also the problem of infinitesimal. Chinese interlocutors, the interlocutors from public, other intellectuals were raising questions such as, does infinitely small exist? Can we touch it? Is it attainable or not? How to deal with the notion that something is infinitely small? How to get there? And obviously there were also classical allusions to that from, for example, from Zhuangzi, who speaks about cutting a stick infinitely, this classical idea of how to attain infinity, as it was also present in Zeno's paradox and in the Western, traditional Western Greek discourse on difficult thought problems. But I'm starting to discover that in this debate, the presence of topics such as of notions, ideas, terms such as mathematical logic, Russell, was a part of a wider wave propagation of Russell's new realism and modern scientific philosophy in Beijing circles. So there were many students, probably many students, intellectuals, professors of philosophy who were still adherents of new realism, who were still investing energy into introducing new realism and mathematical logic into the basic frame of Chinese academic philosophy. An important part of this story was also the private Tianjin University, but more about that I will tell you at my second lecture because it's more pertinent to that. But let me now tell you just that private Tianjin University, even before the Tsinghua University, was a transient, temporary platform some sort of an experimental ground for how modern philosophical study integrating mathematical logic, philosophy of mathematics, epistemological questions of logic, metaphysics, as metaphysics as expounded on in realism, and all these modern topics could be integrated into curriculum. And there were at least too many, from early on, two main professors. One was the well-renowned Feng Youlan, and other was Huang Zedong, who was who held a PhD degree in philosophy from University of Toronto, but more about that next time. And around 1928, 1929, they already had a good curriculum established, and lecturers who were later members of Tsinghua University also lectured at private Tianjin University. So it was a joint endeavor. It was an endeavor of a community. This is important to know. Community is tightly knit, and community cooperates. Community teaches, community learns from each other. And this is also important for establishment of the idea of mathematical logic within the later Tsinghua school of logic, the community. And the community, this community we shall speak about now. And so I will try to be really fast, 20 minutes top, I think. So Tsinghua School of Logic, as it became called around in the early 1930s, by whom else but Zhang Xinfu, was the first important formation as a community backed up by an institution, which ushered in a new wave of approach towards philosophy, approach toward how logic was taught in the framework of philosophy in Chinese academic discourse. Tsinghua School of Logic is immensely important for mathematical logic, exactly for that reason, because it establishes mathematical logic as a part of academia, which means a part of science, which means a part of a strongly built tree, a tree of knowledge, so to say. And once this happens, and once the such a community gains momentum, presence, starts to form more general intellectual discourse, this means also the establishment of a notion of mathematical logic at a different level. So we are now following the evolution of a notion from popular discourse, scattered community, presence, which was merely referential to Russell, referential to the West, to the presence, which was now referential to the Chinese philosophical community, to the Chinese philosophy. And Tsinghua School of Logic, as it was formed, as it was united, it was so also scattered when it comes to intellectual interest, because it was composed at the beginning. The fathers of the department were from really came from different approaches. They saw new realism and mathematical logic differently. Feng Youlan, for example, discovered new realism and mathematical logic while he was still at Yanqing University, probably under guidance of Professor Huang. And his first contact with new realism and mathematical logic was through the philosophy of life, through Renshengguan, which was also the idea of life. Ideals of life were also the topic of his dissertation, which he wrote under Dewey. Before that, he was a pragmatist. So Feng Yulan, although we know that he's quite problematic member of Tsinghua circle when it comes to new realism, analytic philosophy, but Feng Yulan was for at least an important period a stern follower also of what was going on in mathematical logic. Then we also have the very father of the department, whom we all know, I'm sure, Jin Yuelin, the author of the famous textbook on logic, which overshadowed probably overshadows everything that Wang Jingji contributed, which is unfortunate in a way because there could have been much more communication. But Wang Jingji was not a member of the same community. Overshadowed Wang Jingji's previous work, where he systematically, profoundly introduced Principia Mathematica, as well as he already started to discover the objections against how to call it, tenability, feasibility of the system of Principia, which were being at the time raised from the members of the Harvard School, C.I. Lewis, Schaeffer, etc. Later, as we all know, Jin turns, and Professor Chen especially, he researched Jin's philosophy into detail, and he also researched he wrote an excellent article about his philosophy of induction. He later turned to the problem of induction and gradually left the domain of logic as the central endeavor of his philosophy and turned towards creating a system of Chinese philosophy, which would be based, Chinese modern philosophy, which would be based partly on traditional categories and partly on methodological foundations offered by newly emerging logical theories about logic, realism, new realism, analytical philosophy, etc. I have already mentioned Junction Fu. Junction Fu, in the framework of Junction Fu's ascension, was gradual, because before he returned as a flag bearer of Russell's philosophy in China, he spent a lot of time in the West. I think 2.5 years in Berlin and sorry, and Paris, where he came into contact with psychoanalysis, modern physics, but he was at that time investing most of his energy into propagating Marxism and Chinese Communist Party among young members of new scholarly Chinese new scholarly elite. One of those who was introduced to the Communist Party by Junction Fu was Zhou Enlai, Jude, etc. And then later, when Junction Fu returned to China, he later regained his contact with his previous interests, Russell. And in 1928, especially Wittgenstein, when he created the first translation of the Tractatus Logico Philosophicus into the Chinese language, a translation which remained present for quite a long time, a translation whose terminological choices influenced even the writings of Jin Yuelin at the time, especially when it came to how to define different types of event, as we can see in Jin's writing on facts, on what else? On facts on self-contradiction from 1927 and 1928. We have Jin Yuelin, Junction Fu, and Feng Yulan as three pillars of Tsinghua School of Logic. Shen Yuding was a member of a new generation. He was the first graduate who graduated in 1929. He later went on to study at Harvard University, He obtained an MA in modern logic in 1931. At that time, it would be probably more proper to say in symbolic logic, because at Harvard, mathematical logic was symbolic logic. And he continued his studies studies at Heidelberg and Freiburg universities in Germany, which he completed in 1934. In 1934, he returned to Tsinghua and was appointed as a lecturer there and taught several selective courses on logical investigations, systems of logic. He actually represented an important push forward in the development of teaching and researching of logic at the Tsinghua University. He was a fresh breeze which came from the West, especially from Europe, not so much from the United States, and refreshed the availability of knowledge offered at that time at Tsinghua. He later, although he focused in his work mostly on systems of logic, he later also focused on other topics, especially after the establishment of the People's Republic of China. I would regard, when it comes to his interests, which were also passed on to the second generation of scholars of mathematical and modern logic at Tsinghua, his contribution was the most important when it came to many valued logic of systems of logic, and later also mentioning Kurt Gödel and his contributions. Although it is really unfortunate that we do not have more knowledge about how Gödel, at least I don't have enough knowledge how Gödel was taught at that time at Tsinghua. This would be really interesting to know. Maybe there are still in some archives some notes lurking somewhere, waiting to be discovered by eager scholars, such as I believe are in the audience today with us today, which is why I would like to urge you to be more adventurous when it comes to discovering the pearls, the diamonds of history of modern philosophy and logic in China. And of course, the abundant development at the Tsinghua University in general, and at the Department of Philosophy in particular, we have new generations of scholars prompted by scholars like Shen Yuding, Jin Yuelin, even Zhang Shengfu. And one of them was, of course, Wang Xianjun, who graduated a little bit in an unfortunate year, 1 year before the outbreak of the war, 1936, but had the great fortune to have been able to travel to Vienna, where he studied under Gödel. He had this first-hand experience, which is so important in academia, this essential exchange of not only ideas, but experience when it comes to molding, to chopping ideas, to analyzing ideas, to arguing. And his contribution, consequently, was the greatest when it came to introduction of Vienna School and Kurt Gödel's work to his students. But since in 1937 the war broke out, again, we don't know much about it. What we know is that the influence of Gödel in the community, Tsinghua community at that time, persisted long enough to cause the interest of Wang Hao, was probably one of the greatest Western renowned mathematical logicians from China at the time. I'm sure that China has more prominent mathematical logicians also right now, but they need to be better discovered by the West. And Wang Hao was well discovered because he placed himself at the very center of American academia, where he worked as a professor mathematical logic at Harvard University, working tightly together with Gödel, who was at that time at Institute for Advanced Studies. So he also conducted interviews with him. Wong was also important because he was the first person to have conducted computer-based proving of Principia Mathematica. For us, this is relatively simple endeavor, probably, but at that time it was revolutionary. He was also well known for his Wong tiles, a topological invention which can be also tested in numerous games. You can also play games with Wong tiles. Now, this was really crash course on Tsinghua University. Now, let us go to the final part, which will be about Wuhan University, mathematization of mathematical logic. So, the life of mathematical logic as a mathematical notion, and the systematization of mathematical logic, the introduction into the national system of education. Now, I hope that you can already see why I'm talking about different notions of mathematical logic. Because we first had this universal notion of mathematical logic, which was part of worldview, scientific worldview. And in Russell scientism, this mathematical logic was bound together with modern physics, physical sciences, not biological sciences, which was in the domain of pragmatism and vitalism, in the domain of Ren. So physical sciences, mathematical logic, and then behavioralist psychology, and later also psychoanalysis. So this was a bundle of disciplines forming a sort of objective system of objectivity. And as such, they were contending against other systems, such as system containing pragmatism, etc. But it was a package, packed together. And mathematical logic first survived within this environment, within this objectivism. And this is why it was also attractive for materialists, for dialectical materialists, who saw this material basis within Russell's system of philosophy, mathematical logic. They even saw a sort of continuum between mathematical logic and dialectical logic, but this is a matter of another lecture, because this is a matter of 1930s, where an entirely new discourse emerged. However, we had at the beginning, we had mathematical logic part of a certain worldview. And then, due to works of a community, due to works of philosophical works of particulars bind together, and due to the establishment of presence of this objectivity, this notion migrated into the philosophy, into Chinese academic philosophy, and established itself there. And out of this new notion, there emerged a new discourse, a new discipline, a new way of doing philosophy, a new way of approaching towards logic. But this third period was yet another stream which sprang out of new contacts between Chinese mathematicians and what was going on in Europe and in foundations of mathematics. So we are thinking about the famous three, about the contest between logicism, formalism, and intuitionism. Especially Hilbertian formalism played an important role here. So, and this mathematization of mathematical logic happened nowhere else but at Wuhan University. Wuhan University was one of the centers of this development. But before I go, I tell you about how this mathematization occurred, what was the nature of it. I will first make some reflections on What about philosophy and Wuhan University? What about mathematical logic at the philosophical department? Well, it turned out that mathematical modern logic at the Department of Philosophy was also quite advanced. Whether it was due to influence by people like Wang Dianji, who was obviously an important figure there in 1928, or some other influence, we do not know. But Department of Philosophy, at least from 1928 on, boasted with a really rich and upgraded curriculum on logic, especially due to Tu Xiaoshi. Tu Xiaoshi was an author of one of the most important textbooks on logic, university textbook on logic, important because it was so widely sold. It was most sold textbook on logic in the Republican period. I am quoting this after Joachim Kurz, who I don't know what kind of information he has to corroborate his statements. But it was also reprinted for at least 4 or 5 times. The title of the textbook was Logic Primer. We can see the use of term here, Mingxue. This already shows the author's attitude towards the nature of logic, towards cultural nature of logic and essential nature of logic. Logic is such. A Mingxue, a study of names, which is obviously in continuity with Chinese tradition. This textbook was important for us because it also included introduction into algebraic logic of Boole and De Morgan, which is the very start of what we now call modern mathematical logic. But as Tsinghua department was steadily and gradually progressing, gaining influence through its students, the influence of Tsinghua also reached Wuhan University. But Wuhan University had to be a proper place for influence of Tsinghua University to establish. So it had to be modern, oriented, open-minded, whoever the director of the university was at that time. And so it happened that in 1931, Wang Zhuoheng arrived at Wuhan University and became a professor of philosophy there. He was a Tsinghua graduate who introduced Principia Mathematica into the basic curriculum on logic at the Department of Philosophy. At that time, there existed 2 different levels of logic a student could attend at the undergraduate level. So first is the elementary, and later is the advanced course on logic. And mathematical logic, deductive logic, logical calculi of Principia were part of the advanced course on logic taught by Wang Zhuoheng. This was quite important. But as I mentioned before, pragmatism was competing against new realism, against Russell's mathematical logic, and the same contest was also present at the Department of Philosophy at Wuhan University due to Fan Shoukang, who was a senior professor at the department at the time and has also wrote a textbook, Lun Li Xue. We can see this, he used the more established term for logic, and he added Xue at the time as a science. But in this textbook, which was written in 1931, published in 1931, and used as a textbook then, Fan was not really impressed by new realism. But he did mention the development of mathematical logic. He treated mathematical logic as something which ought to be addressed, as something which is as necessary as air for breathing when we speak about history of logic. So it was important for him to introduce mathematical logic, though with some reservation. Already back in 1924, Fan Shoukang remarked about new realism that this is just an unimportant philosophy which will never take ground in Chinese academic philosophy and has got no relevance whatsoever when it is opposed against, when it is contrasted against pragmatism. So he was obviously a fervent pragmatist. So the contest went on at the Department of Philosophy, but Principia Mathematica, at least from 1932 on, had gained its presence, which is quite commendable and really important. But these shifts were part of a more of a larger spirit, which unwrapped the Wuhan University from 1920 onwards. This was owing to the influence of a few, again, a community of a few tightly bonded scholars, teachers, and students who gained interest in mathematical logic. And undoubtedly most important and quite well-known professor was Tang Zhaozhen, who studied mathematical logic at University of Berlin and Göttingen. This is important to note because we thus know that he came in contact with Hilbertian foundational theory of foundations of mathematics, with Hilbert's project, which we know lingered on in several, although it was ultimately completely demolished by figures from further south, like Gödel. It lingered on in Ackermann's and Hilbert's work, their lectures for quite a long time. His focus, his theoretical focus, when he came back to China, was mostly Cantorian set theory, and this was also the topics he encouraged his students to work on. So here is important this relationship between professor and student. A professor returns home. He is enlivened with new knowledge from the West. He inculcates this knowledge into his student, passes it on, not only the knowledge, not only information, but the attitudes towards this knowledge, the academic, the scholarly attitude. He had many relatively interesting contributions. I will later read what my late colleague, Professor Xu Yibao, told about Tang Zhaozhen. But it suffices to note that he was an important member of Chinese Mathematical Society as well. Chinese Mathematical Society was an organization, Western type of organization, which was established around 1935, I hope I'm correct on that, 1935. And it brought together Chinese mathematicians to debate the needs of contemporary Chinese mathematics. And we can already start to understand that people like Tang Zhaozhen and Xiao Wenzang, his student, were already communicating the important role of mathematical logic and set theory in foundational research in Chinese mathematics. So as a part of Chinese academic mathematics. So again, we can see the importance of societies. Now, I mentioned his students. One of the most prominent students at the time was Xiao Wenzang, who unfortunately had no foreign experience, but only conducted research in set theory under Tang Zhaozhen. He authored several, I think even a book on set theory, which was published a little bit later. But aside from that, he authored several introductions to Cantorian set theory. So I shall honor my late friend, my late colleague Xu Yibao, who wrote a dissertation on the concept of infinity in modern Chinese thought. To honor him, I shall read what he wrote about Tang, because I think that these words cannot be surpassed by my scholarship. They were well put and should be reread. So she wrote the following. After graduating from Department of Mathematics of Beijing Teachers College in 1919, Tang taught mathematics at Beijing Teachers College for girls. In late of 1923, he went to Germany to pursue his further study in mathematics. During the next 2.5 years, Tang studied primarily differential geometry and mathematical logic at University of Berlin and University of Göttingen. When he returned in 1926, he was appointed as professor of mathematics at National Wuhan University. At the university, he used William G. E. Blaschke's textbook for teaching his course on differential geometry. Mathematical logic was not on the curriculum of the university. This is unfortunately wrong, but he meant obviously mathematics. It was not on the curriculum of mathematics, the basic mathematical studies, which is true, which is what I checked. But Tang did not use interest in it. Although his focus was on C.I. Lewis's calculus of strict implication and was not directly related to aspects of the infinite, it does show how quickly Chinese mathematicians began to respond to this new area for their research. So we can see that Tang passed on his interest for set theory, for Hilbertian mathematical symbolic logic on to Xiao Wenzan, who wrote more extensively on that. Another important indicator, because as we all are aware, the textual material documents from the time are really scarce. But another indication that Wuhan University, the circle of mathematicians at Wuhan University, was so important at the time, impactful at the time even, was the fact that most of the contemporary publications related to mathematical logic, in mentioning mathematical logic in mathematical sense, and set theory, were published in one of Wuhan's quarterly scientific publication, which is Wuhan Daxue Jika. And this is a really important indication because as we as scholars know, we sometimes are encouraged to publish some sort of particular specialized papers in journals. We know that they are affiliated to people who share the same interests or are even the authority on that subject. The push towards mathematical notion of mathematical logic was accompanied by a wave of popularization of mathematics, which was general in Chinese mathematical community at that time. Popularization of mathematics means that several new journals, magazines emerged, which strive to introduce topics from mathematics to more common audience, to the more common readership. A general intellectual, so to say, and not only to a general intellectual, but also to people at lower level of education. Also, this also included introducing more creative mathematical subjects into the basic curricula of the national system of education. And there were two important popularizers of mathematical logic and foundations of mathematics in 1930s. One was Zhu Gongjing, who again was affiliated to Tsinghua, but also had a direct experience with German academia. So he went to Göttingen to study for a PhD in applied mathematics. And in Göttingen had the honor to attend Hilbert's lectures on symbolic logic and his formalist idea about the foundations of mathematics. When he returned to China, he taught at several universities, mostly general mathematical subjects. But as he was a prolific writer, he also worked as a popularizer of mathematics, as a writer of texts which were published in Shuxue Tongbao, of which he was also one of the editors, Shuxue Zhazhi. And in these two important mathematical periodicals at the time, also his articles on mathematical logic emerged. They were published between 1933 and 1936. Now the main trait, the main characteristics of these writings by Zhu was that he introduced actually what he heard at lectures given by Hilbert. So he introduced what we would say a Hilbertian notion of mathematical logic. And necessary, he also had to address the intuitionist set theory, but deriving mostly from Hilbert's theory. I think that the book he was taking from is Hilbert's and Ackermann's Grundzüge der theoretischen Logik, the basic, the translations, the basic features of elements of theoretical logic. But if we read his papers, Chinese papers, we see that they slightly differ from the edition of Hilbert's and Ackermann's book, which was published at that time. So it was probably Zhu's own recordings, notes taken at Hilbert's lectures, which is quite interesting. Okay, apart from Zhu Bungjin, we also have to honor Gao Xingjian, who also authored several papers on mathematical logic in the style of ABC of mathematical logic, which was actually a style in vogue 1 decade before, where the ABC series emerged, which was published by Chinese commercial press. The ABC of Zheshengguan, ABC of logic, etc. This is the ABC series. But Gao Xingjian understood popularization of mathematics in the ABC sense. Okay, now I'm approaching. Oh, I should have ended. So I will try to wrap it up really quickly.
No problem. You can continue. Yeah, we can extend.
No, it's okay. I think that this will be the punchline I need, so that I will leave time for questions and for responses and criticism. This is more important than my lecture. Now, concurrently with everything I have said, with this migration and evolution of the notion of mathematical logic to general discourse, to Chinese philosophy, to Chinese mathematics, there was also a shifting tendency of introduction of mathematical logic into the national system for education. In the 1928 reforms, mathematical logic was already given an important role in higher secondary, Gaozhong level of education, which shows an immensely important presence of the idea of mathematical logic in this modern outlook. Not only was mathematical logic well integrated in the very texture of modernization, intellectual modernization in China, but this also shows that people who were on important places were aware of importance of mathematical logic. I know that for sure in the case of Luo Jialun, who was the first director of Tsinghua University, because Luo Jialun was a childhood friend of Zhang Xingfu. Luo Jialun also wrote on science and metaphysics, etc. So this actually indicates a larger, deeper presence of mathematical logic, of the notion of mathematical logic in Chinese intellectual discourse. And this presence was the necessary condition for all the institutional phenomena from institutionalization. to introduction into the national system of education. One of the important elements of the reform plans from 1928 was that logic was to become a mandatory course in the final years of senior secondary schools. Mathematical logic was included in the curriculum as a part of the chapters in the textbook on deductive logic. So the students could already read about Russell. And probably the idea behind was that if you instruct students to cherish mathematical logic soon enough, you will get enough experts, and more experts on mathematical logic, more students of mathematical logic will prompt the general development of science probably in China at the time. This was probably the idea behind it. Or even legal culture. Now, reasoning has got many different applications. And as I mentioned before, mathematical logic and its effect was understood quite literally universal. So if you have good methodological foundations, the knowledge of this is quite traditional in a sense, then you will have this potency. You will be able to transform mountains or transform human insight, human mentality, human spirits. You will be able to return the society to humanity, as Confucianists would say. And if we now return to the textbooks, the introduction of integration of logic, modern logic, into the basic curricula for secondary schools and universities also prompted creation of new textbooks. Textbooks which would include either historical or the elementary aspects of mathematical logic. Usually these were explanations which you can find at the beginning of a logical textbooks, main elementary concepts, stuff like that. What is inference? Or what is inference in deductive logic, etc. What are form of inference, etc. The same trend caught up at the universities and normal schools, where in the by 1930s we can see the standardization of mathematical logic. While some special universities like Beijing, Yanjing, Tsinghua already had this push occurring early on in the late 1920s. Okay, the last point is there are just some textbook mentioned, but we will not go into that as we have run out of time. I will not do the epilogue because it is really too long, but I think that we can wrap it up here. Thank you for your attention, and I hope that you will have a lot of criticism, and that your criticism will be voiced, shared with me, and that I will be corrected where I went wrong. And above all, I wish that you would have the spark to rediscover this history firsthand, that you would come someday and rewrite what I have written, so distant from the actual subject. This is the realization of my project. If you will destroy what I have said, I will be glad. Because this reveals development and discovery. Thank you.
Thank you. Then Professor Chen Yong, is your turn. Okay.
I can share my slide. So yeah.
Oh. Stop sharing. Yeah.
Professor Chen, can you hear? Can you see my slide?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Let me first. Okay, first of all, thank you, Professor Vrhovski's very interesting and valuable lecture. And here, I just give a brief, first give a brief summary of the lecture. And finally, I have some questions. Before the lecture, Professor Chen gave me a paper of the speaker. His lecture is based on his paper. This paper is about the development of mathematical logic in the 1930s in China. So my writing in the slide is based on the speaker's lecture and this paper. Okay, his talk is about the general trends in dissemination, teaching, and research of mathematical logic in the 1920s and the 1930s in China. Here is the rough structure of the lecture. First, I talk about mathematical logic as part of academic philosophy from Tsinghua to Wuhan University. Part two, I talk about mathematical logic as a mathematical field of research in 1930s. Finally, I also talk about introduction of principles of mathematical logic into the natural system of education. And finally, in his papers, he gave some concluding remarks. Okay, for the part one, mathematical logic was part of academic philosophy in the 1920s to 1930s from Tsinghua to Wuhan University. This part I talk about teaching and research in mathematical logic in the context of philosophical department at the Chinese University. In this talk, I talk about cover National Tsinghua University, Peking University, and the National Wuhan University. About the development in the 1920s, his talk covered the works of Zhang Shenfu, Wang Dianji, about his contribution in the development of mathematical logic and their thought and research on mathematical logic. Then he talked about the Tsinghua Logic School in the 1930s. In his talk, he covered the following people's work and their contribution in the introduction and research on mathematical logic in the 1920s and the 1930s. Following peoples such as Jin Yuelin, Zhang Shenfu, Shen Youding, Wang Xianjun, and Wang Hao. Very interesting. Also, this is the first time I know about the history of the development of modern logic at the National Wuhan University. National Wuhan University was established in the 1928, and in this talk, he talked about two groups of people who study modern logic at the Wuhan University in the 1930s. Firstly, he talked about the faculty from the Department of Philosophy, especially he talked about the three people's work at Wuhan University. From the School of Philosophy, Tu Xiaoshi, Wang Zhuohen, and Fan Shoukang. Okay. And in his paper, he summarized the characteristic of the mathematical logic at Tsinghua and other philosophical department during this period. He concludes that mathematical logic at the philosophical department was taught in strict cohesion with analytical philosophy in particular, and in direct connection with traditional and modern Western philosophy in general. So this is the characteristic of the research on mathematical in philosophy department in the 1920s and the 1930s. For part two, we talk about the mathematical logic as a mathematical field of research in 1930s. This part, he talked about the development of mathematical logic in the context of the Chinese mathematicians' research and the effort at popularizing mathematical logic as a branch of mathematics in the 1930s. He talked about the Wuhan Circle of mathematicians, especially about the two professors from the Department of Mathematics at Wuhan University, Professor Tang Zhaozhen and his student Xiao Wencan. Also, he mentioned another important figure at that time for the promotion of the development of mathematical logic in the circle of mathematicians in China. That is Professor Zhu Gongjing, especially about his contribution about the introduction of Hebron, a foundation of mathematics and mathematical logic. in his paper, he giving some interesting remarks and just put out some point. He compared the study of methodology of the Tsinghua Logic School and the circle of mathematicians at other university in China during this period. I conclude that the advance in Chinese study of mathematical logic was most of all in the beginning represented by the Tsinghua School of Mathematical Logic. But for the School of Logic at the Tsinghua University, mathematical logic was still immersed deeply in the context of philosophical studies in a profoundly philosophical manner. For example, Hilbert's formalist project was not at the center of inquiries at Tsinghua in the 1930s. And this project has been studied by, for example, the Circle of Mathematicians at Wuhan University. The research conducted by the leading figures such as Tang Zhaozhen and Zhu Gongjing was different from that conducted at the Tsinghua School in the regard that the notion of mathematical logic as well as its content were regarded within the content of mathematicals as a branch of mathematicals related closely to the problem of the foundation of mathematicals. Okay, finally, I have 4 questions. The first question I very want eagerly to ask is about the source of the literature about the Wuhan University. In fact, I don't know this. It's history about the Wuhan University, so I'm very happy to know this. How do you get this literature about development of the modern logic at the Wuhan University in the 1930s in both the Department of Philosophy and the Mathematics? Can you find this literature in your university's library? Second question about the research work of faculty in the Department of Philosophy at Wuhan University. In your paper and your talk, you talk about people's research work from the circle of mathematicians, such as Tang Zhaozhen and Xiao Wencang. It says that the people from the Department of Philosophy, you focus on their teachings, you focus on their teaching of modern logic. And when you feel about their research, so could you say more about the research work in modern logic of professor at Wuhan University in the 1930s? The third question is about the academic achievement of the Tsinghua Logic School. Could you summarize academic achievement of the Tsinghua Logic School in the 1930s or even before 1949? The final question is about the content of teaching in logic at the Tsinghua in 1930s. You mentioned that by the middle 1930s, the range of content relating to mathematical logic taught at the Tsinghua include this following stuff. Especially you mentioned simple logic was advanced by the member of the Vienna Circle from Carnap to Gödel. So my general question is that whether does this teaching in logic in Tsinghua in 1930s also include completing theory of first law logic and Gödel's incompleting theory? Okay, this is my general question, and thank you very much for your talk. For the time limit, you don't need to answer all questions. Maybe we can leave some question time for some other college or audience online. Okay, thank you.
Okay, could you please
Yeah, I stop.
turn on the first slide so that I can see the first questions again?
Oh, first question.
First questions, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Source of the literature. They're mostly articles from Wuhan, how is it called? Wuhan Daily. And then I have also used the Ilan literature. So there were books published at the beginning of the year, every year, introducing basic curriculum. And in these books introducing this curriculum, you probably have it in the archives. There are written the contents of lectures when it comes from teaching of mathematical logic at the philosophical department. I got my information from there. Sometimes you can also find there like professors wrote their reflections into these books and told about the development of the department. This was quite in vogue at the time, fortunately, because otherwise I would know nothing about the period. The same was also done at the Tsinghua University, where every year in Tsinghua Zhoukan, I think, the head of the department would publish his reflections on what was going on the department, what are the general trends, etc. But essential are these literature overviews of lectures. I have access to many Chinese databases, and there is one brilliant database from the Republican period where all this material is collected. Otherwise, all the newspaper articles, even the Beijing University Daily, are from the Shanghai Library. Shanghai Library has an outstanding online access system where you can browse all the titles, you can download everything. I have got my access through German to Heidelberg University. So this is my source of material. This is also why I'm prompting scholars in China to go out there into the archives, those which are publicly accessible, and try revealing new information about that period, because there is probably so much left to uncover, so much positive, good information. So second question. Talk about. Oh yeah, I didn't. This was actually part of my doctoral dissertation, and I didn't go on researching the contributions by, for example, Tang Zhaozhen in depth. And the reason for that was that it was already done by Xu Yubao. I was actually dissuaded to pursue this trail of knowledge by Professor Joachim Kurz, who said that Xu Yubao already told everything what was to tell about their contribution. So I cannot answer these questions as they should be answered. So this is again another call for scholars to. I can repeat what Xu Yubao told, but this is of no value. I would not represent it as my own contribution, my own knowledge. In my work, which you probably have read, I also stick to citing Xu Yubao for the same very reason, because I don't want to. It's to honor him in a way, because he passed away like when I was still in Prague a few years ago, and it was really it was a great loss for Western scholarship of mathematical logic in China. So I must be honest to myself and to you, and I must say that I'm not able to answer these questions properly. I could try, but it would not be fair. Could you please switch on? Yeah. Okay, that's a long debate. I know it's not a good thing to say, but anyone interested in at least a rough idea about that can read my article about Tsinghua School of Logic, where I have tried my best to summarize these results. What were the academic results? How one should at least start assessing their theoretical contributions, because as you know, there is if you read the literature from 1930s, their contributions, the measure of quality of contribution was to get their papers published in the Journal of Symbolic Logic, right? But these publications, if you look closer at the history of Journal of Symbolic Logic, you see that the presence of Chinese papers there increases with the presence of Wang Hao in the editorial board. Wang Hao was an important member of the editorial board. And it was also he who wrote many revisions of Chinese works which were not available to Western leadership at the time, reviews, I mean. And he was also probably the mechanism behind their getting published there. But the problem is that when the last scholars like Hu Shihua got educated in the West and returned. Hu Shihua actually studied at Münster, as you did, I read, under Heinrich Schulz. But we are also not certain whether he completed his studies there. When they returned to China, it was their knowledge was up to the date to, for example, 1941. And after that, they were chasing the Western train. And the problematics with chasing them, and they started chasing it in late 1930s when mathematical logic became split in half, also in Western academia, not only because of foundational studies, but also because of the inner developments, other inner developments of the knowledge which was already present. And they were trying to pursue any of these options. And they were relatively confused and scattered. And if you look at the trends in symbolic logic as expressed in the Journal of Symbolic Logic, you see that they were lagging behind 5-6 years. Like 5-6 years, their publications were 5-6 years outdated. So when we speak about Shen Yuding's contributions, okay, his contributions about paradox were relatively original because they were out of the box compared to other contributions like those by Klein. If you read the entire volumes of Journal of Symbolic Logic, but the rest of them were already lagging behind. So the evaluation is a matter of diachronic evaluation. You see, it's not, you cannot evaluate a publication written by a Chinese logician from 1937 in light of what was happening in the West 3 years ago, because this development in China could have happened autonomously without the contact with the external world. So this is, historically speaking, this is not a good ground to tread upon, and it should also not be. This is a historical lesson that it should not matter how well the Chinese scholars were competing with their Western colleagues, because even the Western colleagues were competing amongst each other. This is also a methodological problem which pops up when you are treating the history of analytic philosophy in China, because there is no such thing as analytic philosophy in Europe as a school. Only in 1937 a term analytic philosophy was invented in order to distinguish. Otto Neurath wanted to distinguish his and his fellows' philosophy from other currents. And the same goes for new realism. So, are we really to engage in judging Chinese achievements in light of something which existed only on the outwardly discursively in the West? Or should we consider it as a matter of internal developments? So this is why in my papers I focus mostly on the transmission of trends. As if you will, I hope you will read my modest paper on Tsinghua School of Logic, where I address what was new and what they did, what was new in their work. But I don't have enough information to conceptualize it more. I don't know. I would like to know. I would like to know how Gödel was spoken about. I know it from books by Wang Hao, which he wrote 20 years later from the United States. I know what Shen Yuding asked him at his viva. I know that because Wang Hao wrote, but I don't know so much. You see, and I have tried to explain why I am not so eager to evaluate like how much, what was their contribution to the world logic. This doesn't make sense to me. It probably would make sense, for example, if we are to speak about Hualogeng and his contribution to mathematics. And Hualogeng was in direct contact with the West. He had the machinery to do it, etc. So this is again some sort of I'm excusing myself from giving direct answers and inviting you to read my paper and criticize my paper. But I sincerely wish to speak more about Gödel. There is also, I have got great reservations about reading Junction Fu, because I mentioned Carnap and Gödel, right, in 1930s. Carnap and Gödel emerged in 1930s in a special 世界思潮, probably World Currents of Thought paper, which was built, edited regularly by Zhang Xinfu, Feng Youlan, and other members of the department. And it was there that they introduced Carnap, and they spoke about Gödel, and Zhang Xinfu spoke about Gödel in his reflections. And he spoke about it like really superficially. And he claims in his autobiography that he taught about Gödel and Russell's theory of type at that time at the Tsinghua University. But then his students tell us that in his lectures, he was mixing dialectical materialism with, it's, I can't grasp it enough. It's a conundrum still, but it is a conundrum worth aligning, bringing together, summarizing, and presenting to the Western leadership. Because only in that way we can communicate the significance of Chinese autonomous intellectual trajectories and developments. I think I will be better able to answer your questions when I will start publishing articles about the 1950s, because the impact of the kernel functions, many valued logic or infinite valued logics by Hushihua, because this gives a further context in which direction the trends were heading, and how mathematical logic and why actually it became as it became in the 1950s. Because in the 1950s, in Chinese academia, mathematical logic had retained its former prominence, its former importance. And this was a remnant of the developments I was speaking about here. But as I said, also, if I don't know enough Hung Chen's work from 1940s. I have got an idea to translate some of his works, and there are some works which also speak about Gödel and Wittgenstein. Maybe I can get a little bit more idea about the status of Gödel at Tsinghua from Hung Chen, because he returned in 1936. So he was aware about the needs of the students, his students, and he would, in his article, theoretically address questions which either were or were not sufficiently addressed there. And one can read it out from material at hand. But I'm again sorry.
I suggest stop here. Yes, I'd like to invite Professor Liu Fengrong say something in a few minutes, not too long, because time is late. Okay.
Okay, thank you, Professor Chen. Thank you, Yang, for the wonderful talk. I learned again a lot from today's talk. Actually, it's not exactly what your paper, you covered a lot, especially the history of Wuhan University today. That's very fitting to this occasion that professors from Wuhan University invited you. That's really nice, especially this what's his name, who did contribution on strict implication. So in fact, I just recently had a conversation with colleagues in Amsterdam. They realized his work was earlier than Husky's work. Topology and algebra, about modal logic. So this is also, important contribution done by Wuhan professor in mathematical logic. So I have one quick question, which I had for a long time. Also, other people ask me, because you spell Tsinghua as Qinhua. Then when you wrote the early paper, you say Tsinghua Logic School in Peking.
Yeah.
So then some people ask me, so that's also I'm asking you now, why you are not writing TS Tsinghua? So this is a small question. Maybe you can answer altogether. The second question is concerning about your whole research goal, the goal of your research program. You also mentioned during the answer to or your talk, answer to Professor Chen Yong's question, you are trying to understand the autonomous future of Chinese researchers. So I'm thinking of what is the eventual goal you want to do. So if it is autonomous community, what is the relation of this community with the world? Can we understand they are making some contribution, or should we understand they are making contributions that possibly by some bridge those people like Wang Hao, so that they can be connected to the world, or by some occasion they can be connected to the world? How do you position the Chinese logicians' contribution? Thank you.
Thank you for your questions. So that's I will start with the second question because it's more tricky and requires more energy. That's a really vital question. How to contextualize it? How to say it in the framework of the world history of logic? This is necessary, but I claim that first I have to focus on the individual aspect. So because not only because this is a general methodology one should adopt in studies of intercultural intellectual history, but because of the nature of the period. So we also have to understand that scholars, that the forefathers had motives. They all have personal motives. They are personality scholars as a whole. And as we can see, their motives were creation of a comprehensive system of philosophy, Chinese philosophy, and not contribution to the world logic. They were aware of that. In 1936, Zhang Xunfu at the meeting of a philosophical society said, we Chinese do not have yet a considerable contribution to world mathematical logic. He repeated it constantly. But they were watching what was happening in the West. Feng Youlan went to Prague and he came eagerly back reporting about new realism, analytic philosophy. But why? To integrate what is good in it and enriching the Chinese philosophical project. So my attitude is adapted to the current intellectual climate. But this is not the same climate which was in vogue in the 1950s. So this is why I said that contrast will be given when I will reach the 1950s. We can see how the identity of scholars is important for the identity of their science, of their undertaking. This changes in the 1950s. But the identity prevails and the importance of the well-knit society of scholars prevails. This is why mathematical logic was not abolished in the 1950s. as it should be after the Marxist propaganda, after the Alexandrov's, Markov's writings about animal rights. So this is, I'm focusing right now on that. I don't know where I'm going. I know what I hope I know what I'm doing, but this is why I need someone to read what I'm doing, so that someone can make sense of it. And I, as a Westerner, am not about to make sense about your history. This is your job. And you mentioned Tang Zhaozhen.
Tang Zhaozhen, yes, Tang Zhaozhen.
This is for a specialist to tell. One should find a specialist who would be well informed about what we are doing, the part of the narrative, and then judge upon what is the contribution of technical contribution of Chinese logic at the time. So this again requires a community. I'm doing the Lanling work at the beginning, the heavy lifting which makes little sense.
Very important work. Very important work.
More symbolically, I am more junction food than Jinyu Lin in this regard. And with regard to Tsinghua, the terminology, you see, we have, as a Western sinologist, on one hand, we have got the Chinese audience, and on the other hand, we have got the Western audience. And when I am speaking about Tsinghua University to a Westerner, I'm also considering how he reads Pinyin and how he would read White Giles, which is TS, Tsinghua. So I use both because I use it for different audiences. And this is more sinological mistake which I have to avoid by adopting either one of the or the second. But sometimes it's, for example, for Czech people, it is simple to use Tsinghua with Pinyin, so that they can pronounce rather than the American old-fashioned Tsinghua with T, which is the official name. But you're right you're absolutely right to remind me about that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Time is late. I think we should stop here. I say a few words. I think Dr. Yong Vrhovski gave very excellent lectures. I'm sure he knows the early history of mathematical logic and analytical philosophy in China much better than most Chinese logicians, especially than me. From his talk and his articles, you can really understand what scholarship means. Find original texts and carefully read them and reconstruct the whole picture of the historical development. So I personally think his research is very informative and valuable, especially for Chinese logicians. Okay, and also thanks for Professor Chen's comments and questions, and Professor Liu Fengrong's comments and questions. Finally, I suggest Dr. Yong Vrhovski, you use TS Tsinghua instead Tsinghua Q, because TS Tsinghua is the official name, English name of this university. This is an official English name, TS Tsinghua, not Q. Okay. Next, let's class. If expecting expect that Dr. Yang Vrhovski's second lecture in next Friday night. Okay? Bye bye.